right, recording. Go. Okay, there it goes. All right, so let's talk about exam number 3. So this is, hopefully you can see it well on your screens. It's not a very good graph that it spits out, like a light blue on white, but there's one score down here, and then most scores are up here clustered near 90%, so the average is actually 89%. So quite a few people got about 96. I believe these scores are, okay, no, the high score is 102% because someone did score 100%. But there was one question that was incorrect, incorrectly keyed. You might have noticed it. I got a bunch of emails about it. Essentially, number 48 was showing the answers for number 49. So number 48 had no answers relevant to the question at all. So everybody got 2 points for that question. So if you already had 100 points, you now have 102 points. If you had 60 points, now you have 62 points on that exam. So there might be another question that I will give points for as well. I just was scanning through before class, and it looks like there's one question that wasn't a really great question, so I'll have to decide what I'm going to do with that one. But you might see your grade jump up again. So this is the average. It looks like with the corrections, since it is telling me 102. So the standard deviation, the spread down here, I wish more of these students were bunched up with these students. So if your score is not as good as you wish it was, maybe it's just that you didn't have time to take the exam or study for the exam or something like that. But let me know what I can do to support you for the final exam. Because as a reminder, exam number 4 is our final, and it's semi-cumulative. So there are questions covering units 1, 2, and 3. And then the majority of the test, like 60% of it about, is from this next unit we're going to start. So the final unit, most of the test is on that, but about a 25%, 30%, 40% or so is from units 1, 2, and 3. So definitely review your old exams, your old study guides. Those will be some useful ways. And if you feel like you did really poorly, say on this exam, you wanted to do better, we could have even a study session. We can even meet here in like this Teams room, similar to an office hours where you'd come into a physical office. We could meet here and go over things. So definitely let me know if that's something you would be interested in. Are there other questions related to the exam right now? All right, well, if there's no questions right now, let's jump into our next set of chapters. So my other class had similar scores as well to your class. So we'll start off with chapter 13. Actually, before that, let's actually look at the syllabus so I can show you what's going on for the rest of the semester. So we are starting chapter 13. We will probably, depends how long this activity takes, it might take the whole time. So we might be able to start chapter 14 on this day. I'm going to try to, rather than say ending early if we finish chapter 13, since we have so many chapters, we've got 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. So that's one extra chapter for this final unit than you're used to. But they are slightly shorter chapters. As we'll discuss today, middle adulthood has the least amount of research of any phase of life. Late adulthood, so when we get into 15, 16, and 17, that has a little more research again, but still not as much as early childhood. So middle adulthood, these chapters are quite a bit shorter. And then chapter 17 is about the end of life, death, dying, grieving, all the processes involved in that for people who are surviving. So chapter 17 is also a little short. So overall, it's a little more content than for the other exams, but it's not too much more. So hopefully we can get through all of those things before the end of class. So also, since we're looking at this, your final question paper is coming up in a couple weeks at the end of this month, April 30th. So be thinking about questions that you have for it. Maybe you already have a question in mind that you want to write a paper for, or if not, keep your ears open as we go through the chapters to see what you're interested in. Then the final exam will be during Monday and Tuesday, May 3rd and 4th. So essentially it'll be very similar to the other exams, but rather than being open on like a Friday, Saturday, it's going to be open Monday, Tuesday. Same kind of thing. Multiple choice test. It is a little bit longer, and so the time limit is a little bit longer as well. So I believe it was like 98 questions or so. So it might change by the time we get there, though. All right. So any questions about the syllabus or schedule or exams or any logistical things as we get started into our next chapter?
So what's gonna be the signature thing for the portfolio?
That's a good question, and I'll have essentially a whole morning about that when we're starting with chapter. Where is it? Chapter 14. So next Monday, I was planning on talking about that, but I can give you a little information about that right now. So the signature assignment and reflection paper, you've already written or you will be writing what will become your signature assignment. So it's just a name for like one piece of work from this class that demonstrates things that you've learned. So it will probably be for this class one of your question papers. Which of your question paper you feel is like the most shows the best of what you've learned or what you've done, or the one you're most excited about. It's your signature assignment, the assignment that shows the work you did in class. You can think of it that way. So it's not a new additional assignment that you're writing. It might be this final question paper that you are writing. You decide, oh, this really demonstrates what I've learned in this class. I've learned a lot. It all came through in this paper. I'm going to use this as a signature assignment. So that's what the signature assignment is. You don't have to be too worried about that. The reflection paper is a short, essentially one-page paper reflecting on the course as a whole, saying, these are the things I learned about. There's a couple prompt questions that I have. If you go to the Canvas page, you should actually be able to access the prompts, I believe, down here in the Unit 4 material. Maybe not, though. Yeah, so there's additional instructions here. Again, I will go over this a week from now in more detail, but signature assignment is just one of the assignments you've done. The reflection paper, basically a page kind of reporting on what you've learned in the class, what you thought about the class. And then also with that is putting both of those assignments into your e-portfolio. So oftentimes it seems that's the thing that takes the longest for students. And we'll talk more about e-portfolio on next Monday. I guess we could do it now since the question is here, so might as well. All right, let's look at these instructions and e-portfolio. So feel free to watch this video for how to do your e-portfolio. And again, yeah, ignore these dates. Let's see, isn't there yeah, this is what I'm looking for. So here are some of the prompts that you'll write about for your reflection paper. So again, signature assignment, one of your question papers that you think demonstrates the work you've done in class, because you really haven't submitted other papers. If you've done, say, the extra credit work on purpose or friendships in early adulthood, you might use that too if you wanted. But I suspect most people will be using a question paper. So here it's just got some prompts. It gives you the requirements, 1 page, 250 word minimum. And so this is the reflection paper. These are the kinds of prompts. What skills did you master in this course? How are they reflected in this signature assignment? Please be specific. What is your biggest accomplishment? How did this signature assignment and other course elements help you reach it? So basically these prompts can kind of give you ideas of what to write about. So it's kind of a little narrative of, this is what I learned in the class. These are the skills I built. And then what an e-portfolio is, do I have a link to that? Might have to go forward in the slides to find the link to that actually. That's going to be harder that way. I'll just search for it and then pull it up really quickly. All right, so some of you may have already done e-portfolios. You're supposed to do them with every general ed class that exists. So this page on Salt Lake Community College tells you how to start your e-portfolio, has a lot of resources. This is basically a little commercial describing why e-portfolios are useful. So actually, let's watch it. It's kind of funny. So again, this is in combination with your signature assignment and your reflection paper. You will put both of those into your e-portfolio. So let's see what that is.
Hello? Of course I'd love to interview for the scholarship today. Is there anything you want me to bring?
Just a sample of what you've learned in college so far.
Sounds great. See you this afternoon. Yeah, come in full dance attire. I just gotta pick up one more thing. I just need to get some more people.
I think your 3 o'clock is here.
I was thinking of rainbow caterpillars.
Yeah, rainbow.
So the final product of what you will actually produce with all the general classes here at Salt Lake Community College is this e-portfolio. So there's a couple of reasons why this is done, like pediology wise, so like theory of learning wise. We see from research that people that do e-portfolios like collect all their work in a place like this, especially when it's organized like all together on the same web page or something like that. Do a better job at making connections between things they learn. Like you might be in this class and a chemistry class, a history class, an English class, and you might not see so many connections between them until you like look at them and have the time to look at them all in the same place, because a lot of your classes overlap with other classes. So that's one thing that can really help you with your learning and combining things in your mind. So going forward, you remember the things you've learned well. It also is kind of like what this is showing, a good place as a resource to remind yourself or other people the things that you've learned. So in art, you'll often make a portfolio. So if you're doing paintings, you might literally have a folder of paintings that you've done. This is kind of that same thing, but for the pieces of work that you've done in classes. So you've done question papers for this class. Maybe you did a group assignment for another class. That might be part of your signature assignments that you put into an e-portfolio that you could show someone else, say a job interview or scholarship interview, something like that, to demonstrate the work that you've done. But the main thing for it, and the main reason we've created it, well, it was created before I even got here, is because e-portfolios do help students to really consolidate their learning and make connections more than they would otherwise. So it can really help you going forward with connecting those pieces of learning all together. So essentially you would have your signature assignment. So this might be your question paper for this class. This might be your web page for your Psych 1100 class or something like that. And you've got your signature assignment, then below it, you also have your reflection paper. So that's the final product. Is your signature assignment will have already been written, one of your question papers, maybe your extra credit on your reflection on that early adulthood friendships, something like that. Something that you think demonstrates your work in the class, and a reflection on what you learned in the class, and both of those go on the web page. So if you've never made a web page, that might sound really hard or daunting or scary, but the school makes it really easy. So here at the same place, you can look through Help ePortfolio Lab and figure out how to do it. And some of these links are different, but I think this new to ePortfolio and examples and the help would probably be the most useful to you. So this describes it. here we go. These are some of the best links to help you learn how to make your e-portfolio. Essentially, the school has already has a website for you. You essentially have to log in and fill it up with content. You can change the backgrounds to look pretty or boring. You can have something like this. You can make it as extravagant or not as you want. The only requirement for the class is you have that web page and you have the signature assignment on it. You have the reflection paper on it, and you give me the link to those things. So that's the final thing that you turn in. So you would turn it and submit it here. So it'll look different for you because this is my end editing it. Let's see, student view. As long as it works. Sometimes it likes to get mad. So start assignment, and then you'll essentially just upload you'll put in your comments, this is my link to ePortfolio. And then you put your link there, and you also upload your reflection paper and your signature assignment. So, even though I didn't prep to talk about that today, I think I hit every piece of it. Are there questions, anything you're confused with on those? Does anyone, also, if anyone's done an ePortfolio or put something up for an ePortfolio, would you describe your process in like what you did to get to that point of having the final pieces on the website? Not in a ton of detail, but it'll just help students understand like that it is fairly easy. Hopefully it was a fairly easy process for you. So let me know that.
Well, I have done it before. It's not that hard. And I'm not a computer person that much, so it has like the templates on the side, on your left side, and you just keep like click on them and add on your main page and choose like pictures or the files, and you can decide where they want to go. So it's kind of easy. They take like a few minutes to get used to it, but it's not that hard.
Yeah, thank you very much for those comments. I think that hopefully really helps alleviate any stress in anybody. If you've made a website through something like, what are some website building companies? Weebly is one I've used before. That's the only one that can come to mind right now. But if you've used something like that in the past, it's essentially the same kind of thing. You could think of the template kind of like a PowerPoint template, except it will end up being a web page. So in, say, a PowerPoint template or a Word document template, there's basically things that you need to fill in, like the title, put a document or a picture or background. You're doing that same thing, and it just, in the end, it's a web page. So it will be pretty quick once you get started on it, but oftentimes that's the thing that ends up taking students the longest, because you've already written your signature assignment, and then you also need to write your one-page reflection paper, so that's short. So usually the longest thing is creating your ePortfolio, but it's pretty easy. There's a lot of helpful resources here. So other questions about ePortfolios? All right, well, if not, we probably won't talk about this next time it comes up unless I remember that I forgot to say something about them. So again, signature assignment, that's one of the assignments you've done so far that shows your work in the class. Reflection paper, you will be writing that. It's just one-page paper reflecting on the class. You've got the prompts there in the assignment. And the third piece is the ePortfolio itself, which is your own website where you put those documents. So, all right, hopefully that helps everybody understand the next steps in the class. I do recommend getting started with basically creating that ePortfolio as soon as possible. You could start that this afternoon. You could log in for your first time to the ePortfolio, click around, see what's there. And then once you've written your reflection paper, then it's going to be a lot easier to just put it up there and be done. So especially with you studying for the final at the end of class, you don't want to leave that for the last minute because that creating your e-portfolio, making it pretty however you want it. That might take a little longer, and you don't want to be super stressed here on the 30th or something, trying to get that all done at the same time. All right, so let's jump into the lecture for chapter 13. All right, so we're going to talk first about physical and then cognitive development in middle adulthood. So with this, let's just jump into it. This is, like I've mentioned, the least research time in the lifespan. So there's a lot more attention paid to babies and death than this relatively stable point in midlife. This might be something, this is one thing I hope you pick up as we talk about middle adulthood as well as late adulthood, that it would make a lot of sense to split middle adulthood into extra phases, as well as split late adulthood into extra phases as well. Right now, middle adulthood is this really big span. But while there's a lot of similarity across middle adulthood, there are some kind of distinct decades, I guess you could say, where there's different changes that happen in middle adulthood and late adulthood. So I suspect, given maybe even, it might even be soon, it might be a couple years, it might be 20 years down the road, but I think we will see more delineation of middle adulthood being split up to more categories. So with this, one big key thing across middle adulthood is that people who are in middle adulthood don't feel as old as they are. So let's say they are 55, they feel like they're 45 or something like that. That's a really common phenomenon. So with this, a lot of our population in the US is made up of middle adults. So it is an area that's been getting some more research now, but people are still very interested in, say, children, adolescents, and death and dying versus middle adulthood. I do wonder if that has something to do with the fact that a lot of the researchers are middle adults. Yeah, I wonder if there's some connection there. So with this, there is a phenomenon called rectangularization of this age distribution. Essentially, if you take two people who are 10 years apart, let's say 15 and 25, their context might be drastically different. So you've got an adolescent and an early adult in very different life situations. One's probably still in high school. One might have now graduated college and in a first career. So those 10 years, there might be a lot of dramatic differences. In middle adulthood, there might not be as many dramatic differences if you compare a 40 to a 50-year-old or a 45 or to a 55-year-old. There might not be as many differences there. So there is a lot more similarities across middle adulthood than there are at other points in life. So that's one reason it has stayed like such a big span. Generally, depending on the researcher you're talking to, might go as early as 30 is the beginning of middle adulthood, 35 or 40, and then as far back as about 65 or maybe 70, depending on the researchers you're looking at. So with this, some things that happen across the whole time is declining physical skills and increasing responsibility. So those increases of responsibility are kind of there from the beginning of middle adulthood, but these declining physical skills, as we'll see, don't happen in general on average for most people till towards the end of middle adulthood. So they become more aware that there's this old-young polarity. Maybe this is because they have teenagers now that are telling them they're old, things like that. And so they get interested in transmitting something to the next generation. Sharing, being generative, we'll come up on that term when we talk about cognitive development. And then also a big part of identity at this time of life is centered around work. So figuring out that work-life balance is a really big goal for a lot of people at this time. So if you look at someone who is 45 versus 55, or 50 versus 60, or 40 versus 50, they will probably be pretty similar in a lot of ways of trying to find career satisfaction, balance there, trying to transmit something to the next generation, whether that's like apprentices in their own work, or family members and children, things like that. So those are pretty common phenomenon during this time. So with this, the gains and losses that exist and the biological and sociocultural factors tend to balance each other. So while you might near the end of middle adulthood start to have declining physical health, you might have more free time or more money to be able to go to the doctor and things like that. So late midlife is one of these examples of a phase that in the future we might see it just be its own thing. So late midlife, and that's from about 55 to 65. And a lot of people in that phase of life experience some similar things like the death of a parent, their last child leaving home, becoming a grandparent for the first time, and preparation for, and then even possibly actual retirement as well. So we could split that midlife phase from whether it's 35 or 40 to 65, and we could split it up to an early, maybe even a middle and a late midlife. So hopefully you're seeing here that some of these things like death of a parent, that can happen at any time in life, right? But if someone's living a full life, just on average, they're probably going to experience the death of a parent around this time. All right, so with this, also there's a lot of changes physically during this time. Not as many cognitively as we used to think, though, but we'll get to that during the cognitive development piece. So for a lot of middle adults, this is really the first time in late midlife that they start to feel poor health for the first time. So if you, for example, have a chronic illness, you might say, well, that would be really lucky to only experience poor health at this time. But this is when we see a lot of chronic illnesses popping up. So, well, a lot that don't start in early adulthood. So things like cancer or cardiovascular disease, this might be the time that they're found and those symptoms start affecting people. So depending on the individual, you yourself, when you get into this time of 55 to 65, this late midlife, you might have major declines in physical health, or you might have none. It can be really individual, and we'll talk about some of the risk and protective factors. You probably won't be surprised by most of them, since we've kind of mentioned them at every life phase before this, and establishing healthy patterns. But it is very individual. So let's hear some examples of people's experiences in midlife. We'll watch this whole video. It's pretty short, and then we'll watch, I think, the first interview here to give you a good sense of the kinds of contextual settings middle adults are in, the kinds of experiences they're having, because I know some of you might be in this phase of life, but a lot of you are before this phase of life. So getting a better understanding of, well, exactly what are these people experiencing, I think is really helpful. So let's watch this whole one and then part of that one.
Today we're going to talk about some of the mental health issues that can occur during middle adulthood on Mental Health Minute with Kim.
Sorry about that. I didn't realize it was going to be that loud.
Middle adulthood occurs between the ages of about 30-ish, and depending on who you ask, 50 to 65. Like any other age group, mental illness can occur at any time during this developmental stage. But the two main mental health issues that people face during this stage are anxiety and depression. Now, you may have heard the term midlife crisis, and it's not really a thing. It's that people are going through a lot of transitions at this time. They maybe have children who are going off to college or graduating college. They may have children who are getting married. They may be becoming grandparents, and their identity has to change with all of these transitional changes that are going on. They may be a grandparent and have to incorporate that into their identity. They may be thinking about retirement and have to incorporate that into their identity. So it's really a time for self-reflection, and other things that people think about are their jobs and careers, and have they done enough? Have they been in the right job or given back enough to the world at large? One of the main things.
So I'll pause right there. So hopefully already you hear some similarities with what I've just been saying, just in different words. So that people are trying to be generative. They're wondering, have they done enough in their job? Are they giving back to the next generation? That is a concern. We've talked about identity development in the past, where a lot of people, just lay people, generally think, well, you figure out your identity and that's who you are the rest of your life. That's what psychologists used to think as well, that once you figured out your identity near the end of adolescence, maybe the beginning of early adulthood, that was your identity. But in reality, especially as we research more, people's identities change dramatically throughout life. It's a lot more of a fluid and a movable thing than we necessarily used to think about. So at this time in middle adulthood, maybe you're coming up to retirement. We'll talk also about maybe you're changing careers. That's becoming more common as well. And so those things change your identity. Your children have all left the house. So maybe being a parent is different to you. Maybe the aspects of being a parent are different to you. Maybe you now have grandchildren, and so that becomes part of your identity too. So there's a lot more fluidity than we used to necessarily think existed throughout midlife. And this is one reason that I think we'll see in the future more delineations across the midlife time, as there's more and more research saying, oh yeah, it's really clear that this is kind of one phase, this is another phase of life, and this is another phase of life, even if they all have some similarities. As we're talking about identity and searching and reflecting on it, that sounds really similar to things that people are doing in late adolescence and early adulthood. So there's a lot of similarities with that across the lifespan. There's definitely different things that are happening to people across that lifespan. So yeah, let's finish this up.
Things that happens for women during this time is the M word, menopause. All kinds of things are happening to our bodies and brains. We're moving past childbearing years and our hormone levels are starting to drop. We may experience irritability and heart palpitations and anxiety and confusion and hot flashes and all kinds of mental and physical health reactions to menopause. We may start to have some depression because we haven't had children and now it may be too late to do that because we're going through menopause. Men can start to really reflect on this time as well and wonder if they've been good providers for their family or if they could have done more or have they made the right career choices. And these are also things that can affect women. There's just so much transition going on during this time that all kinds of mental illnesses can happen during this time. That's it for this week.
So hopefully that gives you some sense of the context and the things that people are experiencing at this time in life. Let's watch the first interview here, and then we'll actually watch the rest of these as we go throughout the chapter. But let's watch this first one to get another example of things that people are experiencing, especially physical health-wise at this time.
Hi, I'm Martha Newman. I've been a physician assistant for 31 years, currently work in internal medicine. So I see a wide range of patients. Primarily, people start coming to the doctor after age 40 because things start going wrong. I really love women's health, so I am just being there right in the middle age bracket myself. You can relate, like, yeah, that's happening to me too. But the risk factors increase: heart disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. Once the estrogen is gone, it's really disturbing. So I really try to focus on education on the patients that you have to start exercising and taking care of yourself. There was a study a couple of years ago that said in order to maintain weight, not lose, but maintain weight in a postmenopausal woman, you have to have aerobic activity an hour and a half, 7 days a week. Gee, thanks. The average woman gains 12 pounds around the middle, just going through menopause. And so if you carry weight around the middle, that's very much a risk factor for heart disease, high blood pressure, high, diabetes, etc., because our fat cells become more efficient. You gain weight because your fat cells work better once your estrogen is gone. So that's a little distressing. We're a machine, so there's going to be parts that just wear out, and that's normal. 9 out of 10 people become hypertensive, high blood pressure, over age 50. But there's no symptoms, so patients don't know that they have high blood pressure because they feel fine. So it's real important to start going to the doctor. So educating, making patients come back and forth, once a year, we don't have to see you a lot, is very helpful. Personally speaking, it's just I'm able to relate, being a woman, once your estrogen, your androgens, which is the male hormone, starts increasing. Gee, thanks a lot. Now you got hair coming out of all places that you can't see. I always swore I'd never be one of those persons, but the eyes just don't work no matter how many trifocally things you have. So if grandma has a little hair hanging down, she can't see it, tell her, Grandma, you got a hair, because you just can't see. It's actually kind of entertaining.
So hopefully that gives you a good sense of some of the experiences that people are having at this time in life, some firsthand experience as well, and some different ideas of what life might be like for a lot of people in middle adulthood. So keep those things in mind as we go forward and are talking about both physical and cognitive and socio-emotional development. And we'll come and watch some of the other examples as we go through as well. So physical changes, visible signs of aging in the 40s and 50s are things like wrinkles and sags in the skin, age spots might appear, hair thinning and graying. I mean, for me, that started happening when I was like 17. So I'll be interested to see how it is in 40s and 50s. We will see. So nails thickening and becoming more brittle, teeth becoming more yellow. And so with these changes, that's one thing that often drives people, in the US at least, to go to the doctor around this time, because they see these kinds of changes and realizing, oh, I have high blood pressure. So that's good. Like catching it earlier is better. So people also towards, especially later on in middle adulthood and towards late adulthood, this gets exacerbated, and we'll talk about it again then. But we lose height. We tend to lose height. So men about 1/2 inch from about 30 to 50, and another 3/4 of an inch from about 50 to 70. So for any individual, it might be more or less, and there's a lot of physical aspects of why that might be. Women on average are losing about 2 inches between the ages of 25 and 75. Also gaining weight, so obesity is rising. Things like menopause can change the hormone levels and make it easier for fat cells to work more efficiently. So we have about, on average, 10% body fat in adolescence and about 20% in middle adulthood. And so it takes a lot more work to stay at a lower body fat percentile at that time. So some of the reasons for this losing height is essentially because the spine is being compressed and you're losing the strength in your back, especially towards later adulthood. So your muscles are less able to like hold your spine up straight. Also ligaments and things like that are losing some of their capacity to be really tight. They're getting more flexible in ways that they shouldn't be, essentially. So they're not holding things up as they should. So that's some of the main reasons we lose that height. Other genetic factors. So my grandmother and great-grandmother lost quite a bit more height than that, or are currently losing quite a bit more height than that. And so some of it's genetic as well, and some of it's things like obesity. These can be exacerbated. If you're carrying more weight, your back has more to be holding up, those kinds of things. All right, so with that, being overweight at any age is a problem that we've talked about, but it's definitely a critical health problem at this point. This is when we start to see a lot of things like the high blood pressure, heart disease, really start to appear and affect other physical systems. Even though you might have that risk factor and be overweight in adolescence, you might not see those effects till closer to middle adulthood. So things like your joints and bones are changing as well. You have just age-related loss of muscle mass and strength. So you would have to work out a lot more or exercise a lot more to just maintain the muscle mass that you have. So with that, that's about 1 to 2% of the mass after age 50 per year. And then with this, you're losing strength, like I mentioned, in your back as well as your legs. Cartilage and connective tissues, this is some of the reason the spine is less able to hold you up as straight. They become less efficient. So this is a lot of physical changes, and it sounds really bad. It might sound really scary. One thing that I think is really positive with development is that a lot of these declines can be reduced or maintained with proper things like diet and exercise, going to the doctor, getting specific treatments for specific things, so that those specific things, like if your tendons are becoming less efficient quickly, hopefully you can figure that out and do targeted treatments for that specifically. Additionally, another positive at midlife and late adulthood is that your cognitive capacity stays really consistent. You can learn you can teach an old dog new tricks, essentially. And we'll focus on that when we get to cognitive development in a little bit. So bone loss is also occurring. So this is also part of the reason you might be losing height. It increases during the 50s and afterwards. Women tend to lose bone mass about twice as quickly as men. And again, healthy diet is a really big protective factor or preventative factor for that. So with this, the eyes, like was mentioned in that video, are losing capacity for seeing in low light. There might be less blood flow, a lot of different things happening together at the same time, leading to declines in vision. So difficulty viewing close objects, you might need bifocal or trifocal lenses. You'll have a harder time seeing at night because the retina is less sensitive to low light. Also, you might have your visual field narrow. So while you might currently be able to see like way back here with your peripheral vision or something like that. So you might not be able to tell what I'm doing, but I'm moving my fingers like past my peripheral vision there. That could narrow, and just because of blood flow, restricted blood flow in the eyes. So definitely going to an eye doctor, even if you don't need glasses, going to an eye doctor to check on your eye health is still a really useful thing at this time. So laser surgery and intraocular lenses are a common procedure, especially for something like cataracts. My grandfather actually had this done about a year ago now. Basically you remove your own biological lens that is now too clouded, and you put in an artificial lens. And so that helps, so then vision's clearer, but it is also more difficult because that lens that's put in there is not attached to the muscles that can then focus further versus closer. So it's kind of a trade-off there. Yeah. Hearing can start to decline by age 40, unless maybe you listened to your music way too loud or didn't use earplugs when you first were starting riding your motorcycle, and then it happened earlier for you. Higher pitch sounds typically are lost first. Low pitch sounds typically aren't lost in middle adulthood. That doesn't come till later usually. Hearing aid technology is a lot better than it was even just really recently, like 15 years ago. So that can help a lot. I think in this class we don't really talk about hearing aids and cochlear implants. I heard someone pronouncing it cochlear the other day. I thought it was always cochlear, so it's one of the two though. Anyway, so hearing aids essentially amplify sound inside the ear, so your own hair cells are still picking up that sound and transmitting that sound to your brain. A cochlear or cochlear implant is simulating those hair cells. It's basically firing an electrical signal that makes those hair cells activate and send that message to the brain. So this is essentially an amplifier to a little speaker for a hearing aid. Cochlear implant or cochlear implant is very different in that it's actually trying to activate the individual hair cell nerves by which we actually hear. And we don't go too much into detail on that in this class. I think that's my 1010 class that we do. But yeah, those are very different. So you would probably have had a cochlear implant earlier on in life, and then hearing aid, again, just amplified sound. So they're very different. Cardiovascular system, we've been mentioning it a lot because it's a really important system in your body. So it is normal for cholesterol in the blood to increase through adulthood. In midlife, it begins to accumulate on artery walls, and that can be really problematic. So high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and cardiovascular disease become more and more common, essentially the older that you're getting. Your risk factors versus protective factors, genetic tendencies as well, are going to make it more or less likely that you have high cholesterol or high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease earlier versus later, like obesity as well as a genetic predisposition. It's going to make it more likely that that's going to happen to you earlier versus if genetically you're not predisposed to that and you've also lived a really healthy lifestyle, it might put it off so that never happens. So this is related to weight gain in midlife, also unhealthy diet in adolescence. So again, when you see a word like linked, you should think correlation. So there's a correlation there between unhealthy diet in adolescence and unhealthy diet in adulthood. There's probably a causal relationship there. There's also a correlation to lower SES. I think in this class we've talked about the accessibility of food and healthy foods for people in lower SES communities. So that is a problem as well. So exercise, weight control, a diet rich in fruits and vegetables and whole grains can really help. There's a lot of fats that are healthy for your body and it needs, especially for cognitive capacity. And so again, you can probably tell I like to talk about cognitive capacity throughout the lifespan more than necessarily physical. But these are pretty simple things. I mean, they are hard to start habits for. So it's hard to get in those habits of exercise and weight control and eating proper foods. But this is one reason I emphasized it so much in the early adulthood time, because those kinds of patterns are easier to then follow up later on. It's harder if you've spent this many more years of your life not eating healthy to then suddenly shift and change that. You definitely can. I think a really great example of that, although I'm not sure all of his health behaviors are really actually very healthy. Kevin Smith is a director of movies, and he was basically had a really unhealthy lifestyle. He had a heart attack and it basically scared him. He changed all his health behaviors and he's lost a ton of weight. His body is different capacities are a lot better now. Just one example of a person that I'm aware of that you might use as an example of someone in midlife who has now changed at that point. So it's definitely possible, but it's easier to start that pattern earlier on in life. So this is another reason I emphasized it. Like in childhood, having parents that are children can see exercising and eating healthy, helping children eat healthily, setting those patterns early on is really, really good. All right, so lungs are also can change their capacity, but there's not a lot of change in middle adulthood. Once you get to further into middle age, so the late middle adulthood section, so this is another example of, well, that's one thing that happens towards the later end, so maybe that should be its own phase. The lung tissue can become more or less elastic, and that can decrease lung capacity. So doing more cardiovascular exercises can really help with that. So sleep can become more problematic in middle adulthood. So more insomnia, or insomnia becomes more common, difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep. So insomnia oftentimes we think about as just that difficulty first falling asleep, but people with insomnia, they might have that, but they also might have trouble staying asleep throughout the night, like a lot of periods of wakefulness. Also sleep disordered breathing. So sleep apnea, for example, becomes more common, as well as restless leg syndrome. And also less effective immune system functioning is linked to poorer sleep. So again, other health behaviors can help with a lot of these. You might need to get specific treatments for disordered breathing, like a CPAP machine or something like that. And those can work really well. So chronic disorders, these are those things that are kind of lifespan disorders. We've mentioned them a couple times. They are the ones that we're specifically focusing on here are more rare in early adulthood, but there are others that are common in early adulthood. Usually early adulthood is when we start to see chronic illnesses kind of rear their head. So things like heart disease, things like cancer are examples of chronic disorders that often appear in middle adulthood. So a lot of middle adults still fight off common ailments like colds and allergies well, but for stress, if they have increased stress, it puts them at a higher risk of getting things like colds and having allergies more often. So stress is one of the biggest factors in our lifespan, essentially. So looking at cross-cultural studies of cultures and communities that have less stress overall, they tend to be the ones that are living the longest. So, and we'll talk about this again when we get into late adulthood and death and dying. Stress is one of the biggest factors, it seems, both causal and correlational, related to a whole host of health behaviors. So, elevated cortisol levels is linked to many physical health problems, and stress can cause increased cortisol, or stress is literally increased cortisol levels. The immune system capacity diminishes with stress. So if you're more stressed, you're going to be getting sick more often because your body's already working so hard on those stresses. I like this one. Stress stresses the cardiovascular system. So, I mean, maybe it's not so funny as I actually read it out loud. I thought it was funny when I wrote it. But with that, the culture and our own health behaviors are going to impact how we react to any kinds of stresses. So, like I mentioned, there's a lot of cross-cultural studies showing that certain cultures, one, have less stress overall in middle adulthood and late adulthood, so they handle it a lot better. They also might have better stress managing techniques than people in the U.S. So the U.S. is pretty bad at this as a culture and a system. Or you might say the U.S. is really good at providing stress and then not helping deal with it. So with this, one of the biggest ways to extend life, have a more pleasant life, have a longer life, that's extending life, is trying to manage and control stress. So there's obviously things that you can't necessarily change in relation to that, but there are things you can do to regulate your emotions and your stress levels. So with this, you going to therapy, things that the doctor can do. If there's a health problem that's really stressing you out, getting a handle on that health problem. There's a lot of different ways to reduce stress and maintain your health longer. So with this, heart disease and cancer account for a lot of the healthcare spending in the U.S. overall, not just necessarily at midlife, but that's just overall. So it's pretty dramatic. So let's talk about sexual development in middle adulthood. And so when this comes up, a lot of times just lay people think of sexual development up to about adolescence or early adulthood and then kind of forget about it. It's not, I don't know, maybe it's not interesting, or maybe it's not sexy to think about middle adults and their sex lives. But there are changes here that are happening too. So I literally before class tried to look up again to make sure that I pronounced this correctly, but I forgot it already. So sorry about that if I say it wrong. So Climacteric, I think is what it was. Anyway, you can read it here. Maybe I should just go to Google right now. So climacteric is when fertility starts to decline in midlife, and then menopause is the cessation of periods, those menstrual periods. So with this usually happens during the late 40s or early 50s. It can be a little earlier though, that's definitely possible. And it might cause hot flashes, nausea, fatigue, rapid heartbeat, but there's also a piece before that menopause piece. So perimenopause is that transitional period where you're going from normal menstrual periods to no menstrual periods at all. So after the no menstrual periods, that's menopause, and now hormones are very different going forward. But during this perimenopause time, there's a lot of changes month by month, week by week, day by day in hormone levels. So these kinds of hormone changes, mood swings, are really similar in a lot of ways to puberty in adolescence. So you could think of it like a reverse puberty. You go through puberty, then you're having menstrual periods and fertile for this many years of the time, and then you go through reverse puberty. And so a lot of those same kind of things and same kind of body, it's very similar in a lot of ways to puberty in adolescence. So all the physical changes that we talked about there, very similar at this time. One big change, though, is that at this time, you have more capacity to regulate and understand your emotions. You've had more practice with it as well, versus a 14-year-old adolescent or 12-year-old adolescent. An adult at 45 has their prefrontal cortex fully myelinated. They've been using it a long time, so they should be a lot better at emotion regulation. So this is one reason that we don't often see this talked about as such a big and dramatic change. Because from the outside, it might not look that dramatic. You see adolescents going through puberty, and the mood swings may seem more dramatic, even though physically so many of the same or similar things are happening during this time of perimenopause. But we don't really see it because people are basically regulating their bodies and emotions better than they were in adolescence, even though some of the same changes are happening. So keep it in mind for people at this age, and yourself as well. So hormone replacement therapy can be a treatment for some of the unpleasant side effects of menopause. So it does help augment some of the declining levels of hormone production. So it's kind of helps stabilize it on that downward trend. And then there's a lot of different ways to do it, various forms of estrogen, usually in combination with progestin. And then it is correlated to an increase in breast cancer risk. So that's definitely something to talk to a doctor about, obviously. So there are hormone changes in middle-aged men as well. Usually we see a decline in sexual hormone level as well as activity in middle-aged men, and a lot more erectile dysfunction at this time as well. So it's defined as the inability to achieve and maintain an erection. So the reason I have this picture here is because this is, well, I think this is a funny story. It wasn't necessarily funny when I was experiencing it, but when I was 19 in undergrad, I was working at a call center survey place. So essentially we had lists of people that advertisers or sometimes companies would want us to call and give surveys to. So I was one of those annoying people who would call your phone and ask you questions about things. So one of the surveys I was put on was for Viagra. And I always got this survey because I always got responses to it. It was really funny because we would be calling men between the ages of, I forget if it was 35 or 45 and 55. So we had basically this list, the computer would call, someone would pick up, and I would ask them a couple questions about sports, like literally 2 or 3 questions, like what kind of sports do you like? Do you like these different kinds of sports? So if one of those sports was NASCAR, and I think there was also a golfer who was sponsored by Viagra. So I would ask them like 2 questions about sports, and then I would say, are you familiar with the Mark Martin number 6 car? They would generally say yes. And then I would say, do you have frequent or, so I've asked this person like 3 questions about sports at this time. Like this stranger, I don't know them at all. I'm a 19-year-old kid just trying to get some money to live in college, right? So I've asked this person, this random stranger, 3 questions about sports. And then I say, do you have occasional or frequent difficulty in achieving or maintaining an erection? So that was my job. I did that for hours a day. Just ask those questions, basically making someone feel a little more comfortable talking to me and then asking them about their erectile dysfunction. So it's funny to me now. I would come into work and I would see that's what I was scheduled on. And I would just be like, oh my goodness, this again. I have to talk about this again. But it was funny because everybody else would so many of the other employees would have a really hard time getting people to respond to this survey. But everybody would respond to me. It was really strange. So I always got put back on it, even though I didn't like it. There you go. So that's my story about Viagra and the Mark Martin number 6 car. and tricking people into talking to me about their erectile dysfunction for that company. Other examples of surveys, there was one we did for Edward Jones, which is like a banking and investment firm. That was actually my favorite because it was so short, and the people, they generally liked that company that they were working with, so they knew that that company as well. Like the company usually sent them a letter being like, hey, we're going to have someone call you in the next couple of weeks. So they knew a call was coming, and they were a lot nicer versus a lot of companies. We were just cold calling people and asking about their erectile dysfunction or other things, how pleased they were with their Dish Network service or something like that. So yeah, now I'm just remembering stories from surveys and people being mean to me on the phone, which I get it. I don't do phone surveys now too, you know. Sometimes I do because I feel bad for the poor person just trying to like make it by in their life and calling me with a random survey. So sometimes I do surveys still when people call me. So with that, sexual attitudes and behaviors at this time in life. Sexual activity over midlife generally occurs less frequently than in early adulthood. We'll look at basically a table of stats in just a second. So career, family stresses, lower energy level, a routine, especially this last one, a routine that doesn't include sex, are some of the primary reasons for lowering frequency of sexual activity. So with that, for any middle adults or late adults as well, if they want to increase that, generally they've got to make it as part of their routine. It might not seem as romantic, but if that's something that they want to do with their partner, make it part of a routine, and then it'll be more likely that that happens. So middle-aged men report being more interested in sex than middle-aged women. And living with a spouse or a partner makes a lot of difference, similar to early adulthood, in the frequency of engaging in sex. And then that frequency is also linked to improved cognitive function. So I don't think there are any causal studies here, but it does seem that people who report having sex more frequently also are reporting or scoring better on cognitive tests. But I don't know if there are any actual causal studies there. That might be an interesting question paper about sexual behaviors and increasing cognitive function in middle adulthood. There's definitely direct causal relationship with like decrease of cortisol levels and things like that. But I don't think I know of any actual causal studies on increasing other aspects of cognitive function. All right, so this is that table I was mentioning. So essentially what you've got here are men at different age groups, so 18 to 24, 25 to 29, and so on, and then women at those same age groups. Here, they're having sex not at all, a few times a year, a few times a month, and 2 to 3 times a week. So we've talked about this in the past, that for early adults, about a third of people are having sex 2 to 3 times a week, a third of people are having sex a few times a month, and then about a third of people a few times a year or not at all. So this is some of the research that came from as well, or that replicated that, but you can kind of see the changes in percentages as age goes up. So those are the things I wanted to point out right here. So you might see that there's not always a super clear like increase or decrease as well, like especially here, a few times a month, low, high, low, high. So not really a consistent pattern. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of sexual behaviors in middle adulthood and what is common and happening. So I think it's useful to see that as well as in early adulthood to get a sense of, well, is this normal? Well, basically a lot of human behavior is normal. So let's watch a couple of these other examples of people living in middle adulthood, talking about some of it sociocultural, like things with their families, things with their jobs, but then some of it's also physical health and cognitive health things. So let's watch some of these other examples. I think we'll skip this, the one that I make a note of here, just because the audio is really bad there.
actually kind of entertaining.
I started coaching in 1980, which is graduate school. 30 years of coaching, all at the college level, and either assistant coach or head coach position. I think that what I have is experience. I wouldn't necessarily term it expertise, because especially in coaching, it evolves and evolves. So as you know, it changes, new roles. So I have experience. I'm trying to get better and better and more an expert with each year. I don't know.
So the background of this video is this was essentially someone's assignment for lifespan development in interviewing people at different ages. And it ends up being a really good example for different things. So they're talking there about expertise. They said, well, I wouldn't call it expertise. It's experience. I have this many hours or this many years I've done this. So we'll look at the research on expertise probably Thursday. And what they're describing essentially exactly fits in expertise. With the development of expertise. Even if this person doesn't feel like an expert in that area, they are becoming an expert in that area. And it also is pretty common of experts to not feel like an expert. They realize there's so much things that they don't know. We've talked about that Dunning-Kruger effect. That happens with experts too, realizing, oh, there's so many other things that I don't know that are connected to what I do. That's really common in experts too. So hopefully just pointing that out so you can see it in the future.
When you coach your first team, you have no experience as a coach to go by. So every decision you make is the first one. And usually you learn by, your mistakes. So I would say the difference is maybe I made a lot of decisions based on what I was hoping a team could do. And some of them may have been unrealistic, or it may have been something that I saw somebody else do. But as you grow, you learn that you have to kind of flex with what you actually have as you grow too. So I do coach differently from the first team to now, just learning a lot about people in general through experiences. There's a huge difference in the ability as I grow up in age. There's no difference in my heart and my desire to do things. I just can't do the things that I used to or I wish that I could do. And one thing happens when you finish college and you keep playing a little bit more after that, and you start coaching, you're like, wow, I wish I would have known that when I was playing. I've just learned so much now. So you start learning, some, but then you hit a point where the things you want to do and the things your body will do just don't equal up. So, and it goes downhill pretty fast after that.
Play with my grandchildren. I have 3 beautiful grandsons. Spend time with my husband of almost.
So this is the one that has really poor audio quality. Feel free to come back and watch it on your own, but you just might have to really crank your volume. And even then, not the greatest.
Hi, I'm Chris Cook, and I'm 53 years old.
And I'm Kay Cook, and I'm 58.
Instead of a parent-child relationship, it's really become more of a peer relationship, because it's not so much of always instructing, but it's one of friendship and fellowship and enjoying each other's company. And then whenever there is an opportunity for our children to ask advice, then we are there to give it to them and to help them through that process, whatever they're working on.
I probably pray a lot more for my kids now that they're older because I have more time, whereas when they were younger, I was too busy trying to keep up with them.
So from both of these interviews that we've seen so far, hopefully you pick up on other aspects of that, like the relationship with children changing to being a more peer relationship. So consider that as we jump to the socio-emotional chapter. But hopefully this is giving you a better sense of what it's like to be living in this time period of their lives and the changes that they might have expected or now they're experiencing.
I think it's a great experience. It's very satisfying to have your children grow up and to become a parent, and it's exciting to see how your child has matured and has grown to become that adult, and then to have that responsibility to be able to become a parent. And that's a very satisfying thing for me as a parent to experience that. And it's a happy time.
One thing is you want to give a lot of advice because you see them doing things that you know are going to be mistakes. And then you think, well, we had to do this and it all worked out okay. And so you just try to keep your mouth shut because the relationship is more important than them not making a little mistake here and there.
But Adelaide is, it's exciting to see her grow, and she's just now at the age where she's beginning to walk, and she's getting excited when she sees us, and we only get to see her on Skype right now. But Christmas Day's coming, and we're going to get to see her then, so we're excited. It was my mother who moved in with us, and she was in her late 70s when she moved in, and she lived with us for about 5 years. And life really changed a good bit, I guess, because her needs were great. She was a diabetic, and she required a lot of time going to the doctor, just trying to keep up her relationships with her friends, or either her sister and brothers, and her sister and brother. And we had to invest a lot of time into getting her needs met. And so the family dynamics changed, and trying to incorporate her into the family when she hadn't been here for, she's never lived with us. So that did take a lot of effort and a lot of extending grace to her and to you children. And so it wasn't an easy process, but it was one that we did enjoy, and we were very glad to have her live here because we know that she was happy and she felt very safe and she felt comfortable here. And that really meant a lot to us, that she could have her last years with us in a good place.
And we had to adjust our way of thinking about her too, because she was no longer an independent adult, and so we had expectations of her to be an adult, but she wasn't capable because of her mind changing, and she wasn't capable of making adult conversation and adult decisions, and it was quite an adjustment doing that.
But it was worth it, and we're really glad we
wouldn't have done it any other way.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's another point that we're going to come up again with the socio-emotional chapter, so our next chapter. It's a common experience for that relationship dynamic, both with children to change, for people in middle adulthood, as well as a relationship with their parents to change. Maybe it's just the end of their parents' life, or things like caring for parents, living in the same household, and being at a different level of responsibility for that. So that's a pretty common experience for people in middle adulthood. And something that maybe if you're younger, or your parents aren't in middle adulthood yet or something like that, you might not have considered these kinds of changes that are still happening at this time in the lifespan. So we've got about 5 minutes to go. We can start talking about cognitive development, because I kind of haven't stopped talking about cognitive development all day as we jump into the cognitive piece of chapter 13. Is that what we're in right now? Either way, let's talk about intelligence. So there's a couple different types of intelligence, and some of them are very important for this time in middle adulthood. So crystallized intelligence is essentially what we call the accumulated information, verbal skills. So if you're going to go on to Jeopardy and do well, you probably have a lot of accumulated information. You've got a lot of crystallized intelligence. You can think of it's solid, it's there in a structure in your brain. You can think of it that way. That's why it's called crystallized. And this continues to increase in middle adulthood. As you learn more, as you build more skills, that is adding to your crystallized intelligence. So someone in middle adulthood probably is going to rank higher on, say, a scale of crystallized intelligence than someone in early adulthood. Fluid intelligence is a little bit different. It's the ability to reason abstractly, so thinking outside the box, to use that accumulated information to apply it in a different context, and you get better with this over the lifespan. So it's actually higher in the beginning of middle adulthood, but for some people it might also begin to decline in middle adulthood. So this is another example of we should maybe have different phases of middle adulthood, because that decline generally doesn't happen until the very end of middle adulthood. So early adulthood, you might be at the peak of fluid intelligence. This also applies to things like expertise in a field. You've been working in this field for so long, you have so much crystallized intelligence, you've seen the problems tried to be solved X, Y, and Z ways, so now you could maybe combine those to a new way. That's fluid intelligence. So this is another good video about intelligence overall. We don't have a lot of time to cover just general theories of intelligence, but that one does a pretty good job. We're not going to watch it in class, but if you're interested or have that as an idea for a question paper, maybe a good video to start off with. So here we've got fluid and crystallized intelligence, and as we'll see, this is some of the original research for fluid intelligence and that thinking outside the box. And you can see this decline after early adulthood. More recent longitudinal research shows that that decline isn't as steep or as dramatic or as early as original research used to suggest. But again, crystallized intelligence is a thing that can just keep building up. So I think I would actually like to start our next class with this video and this example, especially with you having a fresh mind coming into the beginning of class, trying to solve this puzzle. So don't watch ahead, don't watch this one yet before next class. We'll try to see who can solve this the beginning of next class, but we'll stop there for today. But this is about crystallized versus fluid intelligence. This is a fluid intelligence test. So thanks for being here today, and I'm glad we did get a chance to talk about the signature assignments. If you still have questions on that, definitely watch the video that I have here in Canvas. It's going to go over a lot of the things I already have, but it might get you a couple of those answers that you might be looking for right now. So thanks for being here today, and I will see you Thursday.